Well, I think you have to separate terrorism from violence on the one hand, and I think that, um, as I said before, there are theoretical and then there are practical dimensions to these kinds of things. In terms of Islamic law, it is absolutely clear that terrorism, which, by the way, Islam actually defines much more broadly than terrorism is defined in American law. Terrorism in American law is essentially acts of violence that have a political aim that seek to coerce a government into doing something that it doesn't want to otherwise do. In Islamic law, terrorism is essentially any publicly directed violence that has the effect of spreading fear and reducing people to a sense of helplessness. It doesn't matter what the motivations are. They can be political, non-political. So under Islamic law, for example, an act like Columbine High, I don't know if you remember, but where these guys come to school and just start shooting people. Under Islamic law, that is terrorism. And terrorism under Islamic law is the most severely punished act in Islamic law. Muslims, for the better part of their history, have been absolutely obsessed with the sanctity of the public space. And very interestingly, the public space in Islamic jurisprudential parlance is referred to as haqq. It is a right of God. So when you violate the sanctity of the public space, you violate a right of God. And this is why, if one commits an act of terrorism, a publicly directed act of violence, and by the way, when I say public directed, I don't mean public. I mean, if I go, in the middle of Times Square and shoot somebody, that's a public act of violence. But I may know that person, we may have a very personalized conflict. And so my act of violence is directed at that person. Now, I'm not saying that that's legitimate, but I'm saying it's not terrorism. Terrorism, on the other hand, is where my violence is impersonal. I'm attacking the public, all right? And when I have publicly directed acts of violence, these acts cannot be forgiven. When people who commit these acts are apprehended, they must be punished. If I just commit an act of individual murder, in Islamic law, it is up to the family of the victim to determine whether I should be executed or let off or simply pay indemnification for having killed a family member. If, however, my act of killing that family member was to an act of publicly directed violence, I just came into some place and just sprayed the place, then they don't even have a choice of giving me clemency. I must be punished because I have violated not simply their right, but I have violated the right of God because I violated the sanctity of the public space. All right? That's how seriously Islam deals with the issue of terrorism. The legal status of terrorism, Islam absolutely condemns terrorism. And by the way, it does not matter if the publicly directed act of violence is against Muslims or non-Muslims. It does not matter. And even if that act results in the death of a Jew or a Christian, I must be punished. No one can let me off because those people have a right to benefit from the public space as well as Muslims. That's why it's called Haqqullah. And you violate the Haqqullah, you must be punished. Now, having said that, I think that, and this is where we, separate between terrorism and violence. I think that, if the West, and I'm using that term rather loosely because, I'm a Westerner myself, but I'm using it in the sense that it's generally used as we talk about international relations in the world today. If the West really wants to come to a mutually respectful conversation with Islam, I think that both Muslims and non-Muslim Westerners have to come to terms with what they have contributed to the present state of the relationship between the Muslim world and the West. And I think in so doing, we come to understand that it is dishonest to assume that Islam is the motivation and the sole motivation behind all that Muslims do. If I, as a black American, were to burst into some local KKK headquarters and kill all the people in there, I think very few Americans would be convinced of the idea that I did this because I'm a Muslim and they're Christians. In fact, I think that even if I were to quote chapter and verse from the Quran in defense of my action, I think that most Americans would still say, well, that's just a post facto justification for what he did. He was really motivated by something other than these verses from the Quran. And the reason for that is that Americans know the history of the relationship between the KKK and the group to which I belong. And they understand that that history is what's motivating many of the actions that emanate either from them or from me. And I think that when it comes to Islam globally, we sort of become historically amnesic or agnostic. We don't recognize the role of history in the relationship that may be animating a lot of the actions by Muslims. Now, this is not to let Muslims off the hook. The West could have done X, Y, and Z, and that does not justify Muslims violating their own religious law based on the actions of someone else. Having said that much, however, if we're looking for the actual motivations, then we should look to history as well as Islam, and not just simply say that, well, Islam is motivating these actions, because what that leads to is the really oxymoronic conclusion that, well, if we just get rid of Islam or the influence of Islam, then these kinds of actions would no longer exist. Instead of saying, well, if we get rid of the history that has animated these actions, well, then maybe those actions will go away. So in some ways, it's a very self-serving maneuver on the part of some in the West to let themselves off the hook. I can say in my over 20 years of teaching on the university level, one of the most difficult realities to convey to Western students, American students, has been the enormity and the scope of the power that the West exercised over the rest of the world in the 19th century. They have no idea. And we are still living in a world that was shaped by the way that that power was used in various and sundry parts of the world. And some of what's happening now, they're simply reverberations from that era. Again, none of this is to let Muslims off the hook. And I want to be very adamant about that, because my cosmic debt to God is my cosmic debt to God. And the fact that you may abuse me in this or that way, then I have to find ways that are recognized by God, all right, to deal with your abuse. And I can't simply go off and violate what God says in the name of God in order to beat back your aggression. So I'm not trying to let Muslims off the hook. And I don't think, however, that Westerners should let the West off the hook.